it's so different crossing the Atlantic on the north side. So much more of a variable challenge compared with the going down the trade winds. Trade winds are usually sunshine, lovely, steady trade winds, and current pretty much definitely with you. And the North Atlantic is a whole different ball game, which I've done quite a few times, and I've done this this transatlantic New York Yacht Club and the Royal Ocean Racing Club race a few times. I think most of them in the last 20 years, and yeah, it's so much more variable in terms of conditions. It can be cold. I definitely dig out my best set of foul weather gear when I do this race, and thermals as well. And we'll perhaps talk about why thermals in a minute, but yeah, so much more variable. But having said that, when you get to the eastern side of the Atlantic, actually, June or end of June is probably one of the climatologically one of the lightest periods of winds you get. So quite often you can really get a full load of different conditions in the first third. Middle third is usually pretty good, and then the last third sometimes you can be tacking through huge angles with an easterly with a high pressure sitting over the British Isles. So yeah, big changes, but it also a great exciting race with so much variables. It always keeps it stimulating and interesting, particularly as an afterguard member.
Okay, that's a lovely little summary with some great stuff in it. Mickey, let's pretend it's a month to go, or rather you're planning for a month to go. What are you doing in the the May 18th? You've got a month to go. You've put it on the calendar. What's in your diary for that month?
Okay, so I think it's really making sure that you've got all your systems up and running, and your calibrations, or your refinement of your boat polars, understanding where you're going to be getting your weather systems from, weather information from. It's always a changing dynamic in terms of where the best information is going to come. And also sometimes when you're dealing with the weather in North America, there's so many sources, and if you're not careful, you can swamp yourself and trying to decide what you're going to use in the last couple of days before the race start is a bit too late, really. You want to be sort of refined where you're going. And also sometimes it can be really good if you I don't always achieve this myself, but having a schedule so you know all the weather model run times and a bit of a plan. So even though it's easier these days now, but you might say, okay, well, we're going to do 2 principal updates per day, and maybe 4 where you can, because you've got the extra models running in each 6 hours, and it just helps to have a system. And I think systems and habits are great things to have on long races, and it just helps. You can see the differences as well as the way things are, rather than trying to sort of ad hoc dealing with weather and navigation stuff. Having said that, because on the western side of the Atlantic, around say, I don't know, Nova Scotia area, you've got much more cyclogenesis, so low pressure systems that build, and they come from about 3 different directions. They come sometimes from Cape Hatteras area, sometimes from the Great Lakes, sometimes actually building in that area just to the south of Nova Scotia. So when you've got a smaller system and you're close to it or in the middle of it, you've got much greater wind shifts, which makes it more dynamic, more interesting, more sail changes. But at the same time, you need to be on top of it. So you've got to be, you're probably attending to the weather. Weather's a more pressing issue in terms of say a single day of offshore racing there than on the eastern side of the Atlantic, where systems are larger and slower moving.
And what about the plan B, Mickey? We have fantastic navigational instruments. We get very good satellite data these days to download weather. What happens when the electronics go on the boat? What's your plan B when you do a transatlantic race?
um, I I think the thing is you if they suddenly went after say day 3, you've downloaded a lot of grid files, and you've also been running the system for a few days. So you can get a 16-day grid file, which is probably beyond the extent of a crystal ball, maybe going out 7 or 8 days. So you've got quite a lot of data there you can run if you lose connectivity. But also, significantly, and I'm so old enough that I can remember it, is you've actually using the good old sort of Mark 1 eyeball, looking outside and seeing, for example, a frontal system coming down, and you think, okay, well, the wind's sort of about 260 at the moment now, and if I can really see this cold front coming down to me, and I can expect the wind will probably shift around. It's a pretty vigorous front, and it given to where my position is, let's say near Newfoundland, the Grand Banks or something, then you're going to see a big shift rate of wind direction, maybe around to 320, something like that. So just knowing that's what happens in the passage of a front, or a warm front, or a secondary low pressure system, you can sort of get to know the passage of time, how they go, and also it does help to know how long it takes for systems to go over you. Sometimes you get a bit over eager and you're not perhaps used to doing it, and you think, right, here it is, here's the cold front, but actually it's not. This is just a little trough line beforehand, or you've got the cold front and a trough line afterwards, or 3 trough lines after it, and you can over guess yourself sometimes. So just having a perspective, and just to see things, and just have an idea of how slowly or how fast sometimes fronts and troughs move past.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I sort of skipped over something. The 24 hours before you leave, it's a very important time for the boat, for the boat captain to make sure everything's victualled properly, those last minute things that you got to get on board, water, etc., etc. What is the navigator doing in the last 24 hours? What do you like to do in the last 24 hours before the start of a transatlantic race?
Yeah, so my ideal world is I do my personal bits a couple of days to go. And then the last day, you inevitably spend a lot of time in briefings and discussing it with the crew, and doing and I do a crew brief. And sometimes that would take wider issues in terms of safety. Maybe I like to get the safety stuff out of the way with 3 or 4 days before. But the crew brief will go through and deal more of a simplistic aspect generally of the weather, not to get bogged down with stuff. So we can look at particularly the shorter term first 2 or 3 days, and looking at the way, what sails we're going to be using, how we're going to stow the sails and things like that. Then in the last 24 hours, certainly looking, you do need to spend a fair bit of time to do the proper due diligence of looking at all the different models, which ones are we preferring, which ones we like. Looking at synoptic charts, looking at satellite images. You can't, synoptic charts deal with fronts and trough lines, actually, like I just said, so much. You can see what's actually there. Reading a synoptic chart, grid files all very well, but quite often they don't handle, say, a trough line very well. And you can pick that out. You can see on the satellite image. You tie it in with your synoptic chart, and then you say, hey guys, we've got this coming down in about 2 hours' time, and we can expect the wind's going to increase more than maybe the grid file didn't really deal with that so well. Grid files obviously have got better and better over the years, and particularly better closer to land, and their high resolution versions are better. But the high resolution version, you've got to remember, only go out for maybe 2 days ahead, or sometimes only a day ahead. So it's a matter of a balance of which ones you're using where, and also remembering that the high resolution grid files that you might be used to sailing in your home port actually don't extend out to 200 miles south of Nova Scotia.
No, very good point. Yeah. And talking about the start, I mean, I've been on the eastern seaboard in the summer with huge amounts of fog,
Yeah.
and you can't predict that. That's something that's going to materialize within the last few days or what have you. And not a lot of people will have experienced fog and wind. And you have got some hazards as you're leaving land, haven't you, Mickey?
Yeah, so we have got some hazards. Let's just we'll come back to the fog in a second. Yeah, so when you first leave, just getting around the Nantucket Shoals, they've now in the notice of race they say they may put a mark out to keep you away from it. I mean, I remember the 2011 race, boat for boating with Zephyr, which I think Matt Humphries was on, and actually we made a huge gain by going across the Nantucket Shoals, but I don't think either of us really knew our way around it as well as we should have done. And we were going over patches or finding little gaps in the sandbars where we only had like a metre and a half metre under the keel. And I think Matt must have had less because he was a much deeper keel. And that was a little bit scary. A great game, but I wouldn't recommend it. And quite stressful for navigators. But now I think they're keeping us away from there, which I think is prudent. So that's the first thing. The second, then we've got to keep clear of the whale breeding ground, but we're not quite sure where exactly they're going to put the mark for that. That's Mark Charlie, I think. Then Mark Alpha is the ice gate, which seems to be going a bit further south, keeping people away from it. But that has a huge effect on terms of our routing for the whole race, because if that's south, then we can't go as far north as we perhaps would have done years ago. Again, that's it makes sense. It just changed the race significantly. But you've got to remember that in May and early June, they are the months where most icebergs go route south. They get pulled, they sort of break off from the western side of Greenland or a little bit off Canada area, and they get into the Labrador Current, which goes south, and that bends around and brings icebergs down. And I remember when I did the Whitbread race years ago, seeing several icebergs in that area, and it was like, whoa, this is just the size of them. And I remember seeing how blue they were, and I remember being told that one of the upmarket cocktail lounges in New York would serve their drinks with blue ice from icebergs, which I always thought it appealed to me at the time. But so this cold water of the Labrador Current comes sort of north and down and against you a little bit, compared with the warm water or relatively hot sort of hose pipe of water from the which might be 2 miles, 3 miles wide, of the Gulf Stream. But this cold water, can get really cold if you do this northern route. And again, I remember in that 2011 race, we were down to 2.5 degrees centigrade water temperatures. So, it was maybe for a day and a half, perhaps. So it was down to less than 5, and that is cold. That's where you need to wear your thermals. Your whole sort of climate of the boat. If you're sailing in that sort of temperature of water, it makes it cold. And then, of course, because that cold water comes down from the north, it's usually got southwesterly winds, which is the prevailing direction for most of this race, really. That you've got very warm, moist air, and then it comes down and hits the and goes over the cold water. You basically get the temperature of cold water. It just can't hold the moisture like a warm air can, and it ends up being fog. And I remember the 2005 race, I think, where we sailed in on a Swan 72, sailed in for about 6.5 days of fog. And that fog, maybe it was 30 knots of wind, so it's full on advection sea fog where you can get wind. But we had several days of strong wind and fog, and that makes it stressful for everyone, really. Not least just any crew looking out and trying to keep lookout when the fog's and the fog visibility. The definition of fog is less than 1,000 meters, but actually, we would quite often see the visibility down to about 80 meters. So a couple of times we had pretty close calls with fishing boats on, again, close to the Grand Bank. So actually it does underscore it's quite a prudent decision to bring that ice gate down a bit. But also we have obviously we have AIS these days, which helps, but not all fishing boats have AIS, even though generally they do, I think, now for those boats that are fishing near the Grand Banks.
And approaching what I call the Western approaches, where you have Ireland, obviously north of the Rum Line, and then you've got Lizard, which is the Rum Line. If you look at tracks of previous races, you see an awful lot of boats going quite a way up the western coast of Ireland. Why is that?
So you could say from once you got to Point Alpha, which is the ice gate position, and you're not allowed to go north of it until you get to the longitude of the ice gate position on the nose of the race. I see that you then the shortest route from there to basically the Lizard is the Great Circle going around our spherical globe, and it does a big curve around to the north. So generally a northern curve is going to happen anyway because it's shorter and quicker. But also, what you don't want to do, you don't want to get caught dead sort of upwind of anything in offshore racing, because otherwise you're doing VMG running, which is relatively slow when you're offshore sailing. So you want to be coming in from angle, and generally speaking, coming in from the Fastnet Rock direction, you've got a good angle if you can do that, and that's with a westerly wind, which is the sort of west to southwest of the prevailing directions. Then generally speaking, that's going to help. So two reasons you're doing that for: one is you're coming from the Great Circle with shorter distance, and two is you're coming better with a better wind angle. So I think probably as a default, that's the sort of thing you'd be looking at. So on the bit across the Atlantic, you've got to deal with different low pressure systems, and in the ideal world, you might, with a fast boat, you might better sort of keep up and keep on the sort of the coattails of a low pressure that goes across the Atlantic. But if not, sometimes you've got a ridge of high pressure you've got to go across, and how you're going to get around that. So there's a lot of different conditions, but once you do get past that ice gate, I think weather changes slower, it changes more, and you've got quite a lot of clarity. You can see what's going on, but at the same time, you've just got to make sure you're avoiding the sort of the parking lots, to use the American vernacular, in terms of just where are the areas where I might get this badly wrong and where I might stop, and it's usually a ridge of high pressure or a high pressure that you've really got to be careful about. Yes, and then once you get past I think the scoring gate is really to do with the to enable the record from Newport to the Lizard, which I think Rambler holds at about 6 days and 11 hours or something. So you've got to get, but it's a time past there. But then absolutely, it's almost like a second race once you get into the channel, and you sort of, I think it's a good way of doing it is to you change your mode a little bit in terms of a crew, and that we've got more vessels around, we've got tidal systems around, and also what wind, and we've also got a lot more observations going around in terms of what's really happening, as I call it, in ground truth and observation on the shore. But having said that, I think on the last race, it was very light when we were finishing on a gear, where we ended up virtually trying to fight a right round a big area of absolutely no wind whatsoever around start point, and ended up pretty much closer to the Channel Islands, or in amongst the Channel Islands, to come right round to finish, which seemed a big long distance, but I guess that worked. But it was very slow. So yeah, just depending on how things, what weather conditions are, but also you can, it's quite possible one could end up kedging in the English Channel against a foul tide. So that's pretty that's pretty tough to take after you've sailed across the Atlantic. But I remember years ago finishing on Atlantic and actually being kedged off Bewley trying to get to Southampton finish line. So that was even harder.
And each boat in the transatlantic race will race their own race, but we have a huge variety of boats competing for the overall, which is decided under IRC time correction, from maxis to 40-foot performance cruisers. The phrase I'm thinking of is, what's good for the goose is not necessarily good for the gander. What do you think to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as all boats have their polars, and polar is a wind speed our boat speed relative to the wind direction of the boat, and that changes on the wind angle, and it changes on wind speed. And so some boats, let's say you take a Volvo 65, you put your swing keel out, you can load up the boat, and you can be charging along, say, 30 knots of wind at I don't know, 130 true wind angle. But in another lighter boat, their weather routing might be very different, because the routing might suggest them going further south and not doing as far distance, because they're not going to sort of step up on the plane the same. So it's very different. And then if you look at bigger boats, again, sometimes a heavier displacement boat doesn't really increase speed much, so maybe just doing the downwind angles works best for them. And I remember one race where we were racing. I was on a Cookson 50 versus Maltese Falcon, and we sort of sailed past them, but they could just sort of head direct down the run line, and actually they weren't never going to increase speed because they weight that much. So the angles, so it makes very different. So the optimum track for different sized boats is so different. And actually, what's interesting is that Maltese Falcon in the race, but also super yachts. There's a super yacht division here, and it's not many times you see there's an opportunity to big super yachts, and there's plenty of New York Yacht Club members have got some very interesting sizable vessels, and it'd be interesting if those guys come to the start line.
And obviously this is one of the most historic races in the sport of sailing, the west to east transatlantic, Charlie Bar. I could keep going, but 2025 we've also got the resurgence, the emergence of the Admiral's Cup, and we're going to have boats competing from America coming over in this race. And I can see a smile spreading across your face, Vicky, because that's welling you up with pride, isn't it?
Yeah, it is interesting. I'm just wondering whether the boats that we might see on the start line whether they would do this race. But they've to do the Admiral's Cup, you still got to do the Fastnet, so you still got to be an offshore moded boat. It'll be very interesting, and also it's going to make for a really good summer of sailing in the UK. And I think by flagging this up early, I think we've seen this before sometimes when there's been a lot of things going on in the UK. You get a lot of boats coming across, or particularly American boats. If you go back to say to the Yacht Squadron Jubilee in 2001, I think there's a huge amount of Americans came around. The atmosphere in Cowes that summer was amazing.
Mm. And as you rightly say, the east to west transatlantic trade winds normally, a lot of t-shirts and short weather. This one, it's not. It's perceived to go from west to east, a much tougher race, much more of a challenge. Would you agree with that?
Yes, totally. It's so different. I mean, you might well be finishing in the second half in t-shirts more readily, but not necessarily. It's still early summer in Northwest Europe, but it's a much tougher race, and you can easily see. I can think of races. I think about the 2001 race maybe, where there was 50 knots at times for boats. So there was it's a big contrast. You can get some tough seas as well. The Gulf Stream is a great thing to be able to carry you along in places, but at the same time, because of its volatility, you don't need much wind against current there to generate some pretty sharp, steep seas that actually maybe you don't want to be in sometimes. So it's a mixture of a real mix of conditions, and it's a challenge in many ways, and it's one that you look back on in very fond ways with the crew that you did it with, because it brings you together, because there's so many different types of conditions.